Okay. Hello and welcome to another cover seminar. Today we're joined by Susana Caló, and I'm probably saying your names wrong. I'm very, very sorry about this. Susana Caló and Godofredo Pereira. I hope we didn't butcher it too badly. Who are going to have a quite interesting discussion and presentation with us about CERFI, which is a aspect of Guattari's work and life, and well, not just Guattari, but sort of a connected to Guattari in my head that is, let's say, not nearly as known about as it could be. So this is super interesting. So with that super brief intro, I'm just going to hand it over to you before I mispronounce any more words.
Sounds good. Yes, sounds cool. We'll try not to mispronounce all the French names we have as well. So thanks so much, Stefan. It's really nice to be here, and thanks for everyone who's joining us now. So what we'll do, I mean, we prepared some slides with some images from archives and some interesting things to show you, but it's going to be basically an overview of this book we've been working on for the last 5 years. On CERFI, 6 years. We hope it does not turn into 7. So I'll just start. So the CERFI, which is kind of the main focus of our book in English, CERFI means the Center for Institutional Study, Research and Development, was a transdisciplinary research cooperative founded in 1967 in France. It was formed by psychiatrists, sociologists, video artists, educators, urbanists, architects, etc., economists as well. It's funded by Guattari, like Stefan mentioned. There's a huge list of members and collaborators, and we'll always try to avoid just a few, but it's really impossible. So we'll make sure in our book, we have reference to all of them. But just to mention some names. Anne Carrien, who still writes quite a lot about CERFI, François Pa, who is a video maker, Liane Moser, Olivier Kerwil, Michel Rostin, Ketel Marchfadel, François Fourquet, Laurence Petri, Léon Morard, Hervé Marie, all of these people we've been working on and have, established very profound and interesting dialogues with them.
Hi, sorry, Dave. Unfortunately, I can't speak to you at the moment. I'm just in a work thing. Can I get back to you?
That's okay.
Yeah, great. Send me a WhatsApp. All right, bye-bye.
So these are all people who've been working on, they are members of the CERFI, and we established really kind of interesting dialogues with them. So CERFI, founded in 1967, again, came out of the militant student movements that formed on the back of the struggles for Algerian independence in the early 60s. And it kind of fused research, the will to kind of produce research, and political struggle. And in a way, kind of very briefly set out to reinvent modes of organizing and working, taking into account the issues of desire and subjectivity and the unconscious. In other words, in the words in which they'll kind of use to kind of explain and attempt to fuse and bring together Marx on one side and Freud on the other side. So CERFI was active until 1987. And it was concerned with programming of local collectivities, organizations, and social institutions, referred to as collective equipment. And under the heading of this idea of programming institutions or institutional programming, it set out to convert institutional process into mechanisms of empowerment. So like Stefan said, this work is not very well known. It appears most often as a footnote to, Guattari's work or to Foucault's work, because Foucault has also worked with CERFI. So beyond kind of, these footnotes on the side notes in the works of, these big thinkers like Foucault, Deleuze, Guattari as well, the collective work, the essence of the collective work, and not just the ideas and intellectual production, but also the very practical projects that were developed are not very well known. The memory of CERFI has been kept alive, I think, mostly by Anne Carrien, which is a kind of a founder of the CERFI as well, who keeps writing about the CERFI. So her work is extremely important. She always makes, this CERFI kind of bear on, contemporary debates whenever she can. So we owe quite a lot to her. But our decision to kind of focus on the CERFI is not really to provide a history of the CERFI. We try to say there's not one CERFI, there's many, many CERFIs, as many as people can write about, because their work is huge and very, very diverse and heterogeneous. And that's what is captivating for us. But we're particularly interested in how analysis and how analytical practices, this concern with unconscious, has been dealt with. There was a concern we deal with this dimension in projects outside of the clinic, outside of the psychoanalytical setting. So in simple terms, we understand analysis as the creation of situations whereby the unconscious or libidinal relations are made visible and workable. And in saying this, how do I move? In saying, we're trying to move on to, okay. So in saying this, it's just important to say that we really like this quote of the desire, only desire can redesire. We therefore cannot insist enough on the necessity of a certain transference of initiation. The subject producing a study must be meshed in one way or another with the mode of initiation of the subject concerned by the study. We really like this quote that speaks of desire and kind of research at the same time, because he has, the research we're producing has been conducted by our very own interests. Godofredo has been working on collective equipment and radical politics. I've been working on radical psychiatry and psychopolitical claims. So this idea of the exploration of the analytical practices beyond the clinical setting, something that drives us, something where our interests lie. And this idea was also core to the constitutional CERFI as a research cooperative, which went to explore, the importance of analysis outside of the clinical context, in context of urban planning, the programming of mental health or educational equipment, and themselves as well. So to say how, they were also kind of programming themselves as a collective and experimenting with that collective and analytical dimension.
So to explain then a bit more, right? So if the idea that brings us to doing this work, and of course in this short presentation, we cannot give an idea of what the work is, right? Of its full extent. So we'll try to focus mostly on this idea of analysis and on this idea of bringing analysis outside of the clinical setting. And how does it come to be towards the constitution of CERFI? The reason why we're interested in it is both, as Susana was saying, that it comes out of our own works, but also because in the sense that we find it particularly relevant. The types of questions and the mode by which those questions are posed remain incredibly relevant for militancy, for transversal militancy between research, militant organizations, activism at ecological and social levels, very much important today, right? And it's always something that we hope can enter into composition with ongoing debates. But just to explain very briefly, so what's happening after the in this story, more or less already written, right, around the pre-68, we had a series of militant organizations and militant groups from the student side, particularly, that create this constellation of organizations on the back of militant mobilization during the late 50s, early 60s, in support of the Algerian Revolution and support for decolonization. And it's a body of institutional creation and invention within student movements, right? So we have here a poster from UNEF, which is the National Union, I'm translating from French, Union Nationale des Étudiants Français, so National Unit of French Students. We can bring a few more from MENEF, which is the Mutuelle, the Mutuelle Nationale des Étudiants Français. Different types of organizations that are emerging both in philosophy, in letters, in and then the creation of the GTU, the Groupe de Travail Universitaire, so the working groups within universities producing research about universities themselves, and many other groups, not necessarily focused on academic institutions themselves. We have the Vietnam committees being constituted, both the Maoist version and the Trotskyist version, and different bodies that are ultimately having a conversation about communism. And at two levels, both in terms of an international debates that are taking place at that time between Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalinism, Maoism starting, or the Chinese, let's say, version starting to emerge in the overall conversation, revolutionary movements in the third world, so on and so forth. So there's an international debate within communism that manifests within debates within the student union movements. While at the same time, those debates are also bringing in institutional creativity of the student movements, looking at the academic institutions themselves. So in one way, looking to the outside, in the other way, looking to the inside. And so it's a very, very long story, but hopefully we'll try to convey that there's an encounter and there's all sorts of debates within student movements, at which point they start, part of this movement, start looking at the inside into questions of sexuality, questions of working conditions, about looking at suicides within student bodies. And these debates they make contact with the movement in France called the psychotherapy, the institutional psychotherapy movement in France, and particularly with a group which is the Je te Psy, which is the group, the working group on psychotherapy and social therapy, on institutional psycho and social therapy. And they make contact with this group because they wanted to bring someone in not only to look at the mental and physical health conditions of students in relation to their institutional conditions, in relation to the mode of working within academic institutions, right? And the Je te Psy is part of a similar debate that's happening in a way around mental hygiene, as it was called, or what we would call today mental health in France. And again, with already written history as well, that is shifting the look, the way that you approach mental health, ceasing to look at the individual and looking at the institutional conditions of production of what the mental is in the first place, right? On the back of the works of François Tosquel in Saint-Albin, where you had Canguilhem writing about the normal and the pathological, Foucault starting to write about these issues, so on and so forth. So again, the movement of institutional psychotherapy, in which what is actually therapeutic is to understand the institution as the institution itself being pathological, enters in contact with student movements, starting to reflect not only on academic institutions, but to reflect as well on international communism, right? And the different types of approaches and capacities within international communism, and specifically, of course, what was perceived to be a very kind of reactionary French Communist Party, which was not obviously nor declaredly supporting Algerian liberation struggle, right? And so from the side of the student movement, also a perceived incapacity from the French Communist Party, and even in many ways from Trotskyist versions and other types of, from the International Communist Party, in actually being able to recognize multiple vectors of revolutionary transformation, right? So other types of priorities. This encounter is then embodied in the figure of Félix Guattari, who's a well-known militant activist already at that time. So there's this kind of encounter of generations. So Guattari is mid-30s. These students, most of them are early to mid-20s. And this generational encounter, so Guattari he does this cycle himself, right? He's invited to enter into the institutional psychotherapy movement because he was a very active activist within the youth hostels movement in France. He comes to work at Laborde with Jean-Henri. And when he comes then after a few years as one of these institutional psychotherapy experts to come to meet the students, the brilliant encounter that happens at that time is, and I won't speak very much about Laborde because it's well known, but let's say Guattari was working at Laborde, which is one of the main institutions exploring institutional psychotherapy, i.e. exploring the fact, developing therapy at the level of institutional, legal, political, ethical, and material environment, right? So it's institutional relationships that need to be worked. And it's the working of those institutional relationships, qua self-management, that is actually therapeutic, right? And so Guattari is coming from that logic. I encountered the student movements. And out of this emerges a very rich conversation, both at the level of what is it that analysis that's becoming an institutional analysis within institutional psychotherapy movement can bring to bear on the institutional struggles and issues that students are debating with themselves, but actually can bring to bear on reflections on international communism at large, right, and those conversations. So this is a few slides about institutional, what's happening at Laborde. And again, there are very interesting mechanisms taking place there that become very influential to the students when this context starts emerging, right? But I won't speak much to it now. If not, it takes the entire presentation. But so one of these first moments is the journal, a publication called Opposition de Gauche. So there was, a network of leftist students and militants, not just students, that would locate themselves as a left-wing opposition to the French Communist Party, right? And so they start with Guattari and the students, they start organizing a series of newspapers and publications called the Bulletin d'Opposition to the Communist Left. So the OG Bulletin, also known as the Red Square, in which it mixed conversations around institutional psychotherapy with international revolutionary practices, right? I won't speak much to it, but one of the key components of that was this objects that we have in front of us, which is the thesis, the 9 theses on left-wing revolution, the 9 theses of the left-wing opposition. And those theses, they touch upon many things, but the 2 main ones that would note is one, the limitation of international revolutionary movement when they focus too much on taking control of the state. In over-focusing on taking control of the state, they would miss a series of political and revolutionary transformations that needed to be taken into account. While, at the same time criticizing the bureaucratic centralism of the French Communist Party. And actually Guattari would criticize the bureaucratic centralism also of Trotskyist organizations often, even though at the time he was affiliated with Trotskyist organizations. And basically they're concerned with the need for inventing new types of institutions, right? So, and we can see how this brings this influence from the institutional psychotherapy movement, unlike what is the British anti-psychiatry movement, unlike the Italian movement. Institutional psychotherapy movement in France was very much about criticizing the institution by reinventing institutional processes, right? And in French, to institute is not simply the institution of the state, but is the invention of new social collective constructions, right? And so this invention of institutional processes is very much coming from institutional psychotherapy, finds and invents this strange composition between militant student movements and institutional invention, which fits very well with their critique of the party, but it's not to say, let's go against parties at large. No, we need to invent new types of revolutionary organizations. We're spending too much time for our presentation on this point, so I'll eventually come back to it in the conversation. After Opposition de Gauche, which was created in the journal, which was created in 64, lasted until 66, more or less. Until 67. They've also created in 65 the FGERI, which is the Federation on the General Federation on Research on Institutional Formations. And the FGERI brought together in a much more rhizomatic logic, and this is probably the first rhizomatic thing in which Guattari is properly involved, a multiplicity of different research, action research organizations. The difference from Opposition de Gauche was that while Opposition de Gauche was more bringing together the margins, the leftist margins of all of these groups, but essentially built on student movements, FGERI was built on the connection between student movements and professional organizations, right? So as you can see here, we listed, this is from one of their magazines. So they started publishing this journal called Recherches. And they list constantly different types of groups, right? So we have architects, ethnologists, cinema, literary research, linguistics, institutional pedagogy. So in parallel to institutional psychiatry, there was a group, very close-knit group of institutional pedagogy. And bringing these conversations, not simply at the level of bringing, let's say, analysis from the institutional side into militancy and into a reflection on militancy, i.e., how do we think analytical practices within militant institutions and reinventing new types of institutions, able to analyze the pragmatic of social conditions and social transformations, but now bringing analysis into the professional field, right? So the types of devices and thinking of analysis, of collective institutional analysis within therapeutic institutions is relevant, not simply to think of mental health, but it's actually relevant to think of any type of social organization, any type of institutional organization. So in the first level, to identify and to criticize lacks within militant institutions, and in the second level, actually to expand that's not simply a militant problem, is a problem of a type of revolutionary process that should traverse every type, all types of institutions that were part and parcel of, be it the factory or any research group or any professional corporate organization, right? I'll quote here, the simple idea behind this federation was that in every domain where intellectual labor is deployed, and the labor of the manual worker is also intellectual labor, the workers encountered forces that Félix would come later on to call the forces of anti-production. That is, social forces that prevented them from reaching the best possible realization of whatever it is that they plan to do. And so, yeah, there's all sorts of interesting groups that FGERI was part of. One of them not on this list is Godofredo, which is the group of bonnes femmes de gauche, so the group of good women of the left. And again, emerging feminist group, which again, emerging feminist movements were very crucial to 68, just a couple of years after, right? So this process continues. FGERI had both the magazine Recherches and it had the Cahiers de FGERI. Of course, this Cahiers was slightly less successful and much more informal for internal distribution. But already before 68, what it leads is to the constitution of CERFI, finally. And CERFI is this same group of people. Well, there's always a variation, there's a constellation, right? But CERFI forms itself, firstly, as an opportunity for FGERI to receive funding from the state to develop some of these researchers, right? So FGERI was the actual thing, and CERFI was just a mechanism to receive research funding. Then May of 68 happens. A lot of the libidinal, let's say, a lot of the energy that brought these research networks and these activist networks together, a lot of that energy dissipated the capacity to keep the kind of a gigantic federation of conversations together. These are hundreds of people, right? Dissipated a bit. And so CERFI, which was initially a research funding machine to be able to keep going and to survive, becomes much more important because now a lot of these groups want to be able to continue this work And CERFI becomes a mechanism for survival as well, a mechanism, to receive funding from the state to develop action research, independent research outside of the main research institutions, but is a research that's very much concerned with bringing this analytical demand, right, from militancy into every field of social life and of institutional creation, to continue that interrogation and to continue that investigation. And their main purpose was, we don't want to do things as they've done it in the US and go to the middle of the countryside and have our own, whatever, autonomous commune. We want to work against the most bureaucratic conditions of the state, of the French state, which, as we all know, is a gigantic bureaucratic machine. And we want to be able to work within and against in some way, right? And so they continue this idea of analysis now, and they look into this idea of analysis towards state, right? And how to do it? There are many angles where you can think analysis. And just to clarify again, by analysis we mean creating the conditions to understand the types of forces that traverse these processes. Sorry, I forgot to skip through some of their images. And so they start looking at analysis at the level of programming. So the French state, and other states have slightly different words for this, but in France you have the word institutional programmer, or which is a bureaucratic figure within the French state that that sits behind or before planning, so town planning and the planning of equipment, the planning of institutions, analyzing statistically and bureaucratically the demand, right? The supply and demand. We need 5 new hospitals with 200 new beds. We need 7 schools with X amount of classrooms, so on and so forth, right? And through their contacts with institutional processes in the field of psychiatry and mental health, CERFI had come to publish quite a lot already before 68, and so during 67 and 69, on how incompetent the French state was on identifying issues of supply and demand, essentially, by simply having a statistical analysis of what exists without questioning the reasons for why such schools and such hospitals should exist in such and such a way. Why more hospitals and not something completely different? Why more schools instead of breaking down what we understand to be the demands that need to the constitution of the school in the first place, right? Which turns out to be a very Foucauldian type of concern as well at this point. So they're criticizing the way in which the state is programming, and they say, we need to invent a new figure of the programmer. And they pitch this to the state, the French government, to the Ministry of Urban Development. They make this pitch, and weirdly enough, they get funded. There's not weirdly enough, there's good reasons for it that won't go into it now. The pitch to say, you can only do proper programming if you're prepared to analyze the social, to understand and analyze the social unconscious of institutions, right? The institutional unconscious. And from a specific character in the French state is interested and says, well, actually, yeah, I'm curious, what do you mean analyzing the institutional unconscious, right? What do you mean by this pitch, essentially? And they gain a series of contracts year after year to explore that. At this time, the French state was developing a series of new towns. Again, I won't go into that. There's an entire conversation about the new towns in France. But it was an opportunity in which CERFI got brought in to program new towns and to program certain types of collective equipment. So in English, you'd say public facilities or collective facilities. But let's say collective equipment means social centers, nurseries, mental health equipment, schools, playgrounds, social associations that worked in relation to housing, all sorts of social and collective or community equipment from the French state. And they came to program them. So from their side, they're bringing in this idea of institutional analysis that, again, to continue telling the story, that starts by being a problem that militant organizations they lack analytical mechanisms that allow them to identify revolutions, right? And they're focused just on one aspect of it. So they're very bureaucratic, centralist, and unable to recognize different vectors of revolution. Then this story composes with questions that have to do with reflecting on student union movements and etc., into creating new type of revolutionary institutions, right? We need a new type of party, a new type of revolutionary institutions. Then that continues in saying those revolutionary institutions are actually, every institution that exists in the world needs a militant analytical aspect on its inside, right? So Sherry comes into that. And then now it involves in saying, actually, it needs to continue also to programming through this idea of programming, right? And then they bring this and they try to bring to program, and by program means creating collective processes, catalyzing collective processes of collective analytical processes within these institutions, qua collective group conversations, qua self-management of all sorts of aspects, qua transversalizing different, the bureaucratic crystallisations within these institutions and putting them in conversations with each other, so on and so forth. And we go through how they try to do this in the book, and as one might expect, the difficulties very obvious of trying to do this against and within the French state. We go through that. I won't go through it now. Within a certain tension between starts emerging within CERFI, where part of the group is looking at this in terms of these equipments, for example, a school that we have in front of us as an equipment of normalization, in concern with the types of codes and social codes that come with it. Whereas other part of the group is less focused on the codes themselves and more focused on the axiomatics, more Guattarian, so to say, more aligned, not so much with the institutions themselves, but with capitalism at large, right? So there's a growing tension that we start tracing in CERFI post-68, as part of the group is more focused on how capitalism co-opts subjectivity across every field, and other part remains more focused on the specifics of the French state and its apparatus. And again, the reasons for that are quite interesting and lengthy. So just going through some of the things that they've done, different type of very bureaucratic research processes and studies. Of course, the first thing that they discover is that they cannot program. They're unable of programming. They don't have any control to it. So they end up proposing more than proposing programming per se. They propose the constitution of new types of teams, which would be nomadic, dynamic, institutional analyzer teams, whose role would be to essentially to cut through blockages, bureaucratic and power blockages within those institutions, with mixed successes, as one might imagine. At the same time, they develop this work both in practice, in action research, together, through interviews, through collective processes, through a lot of debates with different partners on the ground during the implementation of Militants. And in parallel, they're developing a more theoretical, genealogical research into the history of collective equipment, of the idea of collective, the idea of equipment. And the equipments of power are sometimes the equipments of capital, of power, of the state. Sometimes they're collective equipment, sometimes they're equipments of power, sometimes they're equipment of normalization. So there's an ecology of terms and concerns that become part of CERFI and structure CERFI throughout its life, developing then a vast body of work on primary school research, on law in the French state, on education in the French state, on the history of autonomous and mutualist education in France. So on a very rich body of work that we're only able to glimpse in a way in our book, because that's at least just in their own publication, there are 48 issues, incredibly, 46 or 48, I forget, a huge amount of issues of work that they've developed, right, from psychiatry to all levels of institutional organization within the French state. We cut through it and we try to look through the moments in which analytical practices and this idea of militant analysis remains and goes throughout. And this is just some of the images of the different types of reports that they've developed. So part of it was reports for the state, other part was action research on the ground. And it continues and continues up to 84. Some of the most successful analytical at the urban level, so they ended up working a lot at the level of planning and at the level of urban communitary transformations, right? Took place slightly later on in Almagar, which is in Roubaix in France, where CERFI was on the back of the creation of popular ateliers of urbanism. So organizing different types of local groups and local neighborhood organizations and different types of militant groups coming together to produce counter planning against the state and actually implement it, which was a massive, massive victory. And this is just some of the images, and the book, we spent quite a lot of time on this. Also the same happening in Almagar, in Marseille. But it's interesting what we trace is how this kind of this problem of analysis and, militant analysis encounters generationally as it starts entering the late 70s, the mid to late 70s and the 80s, encounters a different leftist generation, much more concerned now with issues of participation and processes for participation. And so there are also very interesting tensions that emerge within the group on that. So this is Almagar, this is Petit Séminaire in Marseille. Some of these images, and we can speak a bit more to that later on if you have questions on that. But another aspect is how CERFI itself, then we dedicate quite a lot of time to how CERFI itself, instead, beyond exploring analytical practices at urban levels, in planning, in different type of organizations. So, they were invited by FNAC, which was a federation at the time, to develop teaching and programs for self-management. And they worked a lot at this nexus of self-management qua analysis and analysis qua self-management. They also took themselves as a group as a target of analysis and experimentation of group analytical enterprise from themselves.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that, we might often kind of be interested in these kind of experiments and, programming and collective equipment, but what about what's happening in terms of the collective itself and the group itself? Although it's something we try to understand through interviews, exactly how were this kind of orientation and this attention that was being paid into, the collective and the unconscious, was that playing out in the group? In what way? And that's very interesting. I think this is one of the most interesting things that we found is how they organize themselves. So to start with, the way, if you kind of have to look at their review, kind of recherches, we have quite a few, and we're going to show them in the slides as well. The people that have written on recherche and the groups that were involved in the 46 issues of recherche are immense. And the way, for example, someone like Anne Guérien describes the CERFI, and this is also kind of written in some of recherche, is that the CERFI is not just made up by the people that have developed research projects or has been involved in the field at one point or another, but the CERFI is defined as well by those that were impacted by its research. A really interesting point is kind of how many people have been involved in CERFI in one way or another. So one of and possibly the most important routine for CERFI was a meeting that they would do weekly, that is called the Tuesday meetings in Paris, in which it was kind of a general assembly, in which not only the active CERFI members, but everyone that wanted to come to the meetings could come and could discuss the projects of CERFI. But at some point in those meetings, there was also people that would appear that had no previous relationship with CERFI, that may have heard about CERFI or been brought in by some member, and they would propose a project. And then they would try to find money to kind of find that project. And that is key. And it's what interesting is that if you ask them, but what kinds of projects you could come as someone that was not part of CERFI and propose, and suddenly start to be developed. And they would say something like this: well, we were a collective, and let's say that someone that we don't know comes with an idea. And if someone from our collective wants to support that idea and make a team with that other person, so if suddenly a group kind of emerges in that process, then that was enough. That meant there was a specific, there was some of our interviews refer to this as a collective assemblage, really, something that happens in that moment, and then a different group gets created. So that process of, proposing an idea for a project and someone else is interested, and they kind of form another group. So really the most important routines of CERFI was this Tuesday meeting, which was, it was a meeting that was open to everyone. We also inquired quite a lot about issues of money, about issues of pay. So there were no projects in CERFI that were done without money. What does that mean? It means that if you had an idea for a project, that had to come with funding. Otherwise, you wouldn't work on that project. The other thing is that in terms of kind of pay, in principle, all of them would receive the same amount, the same salary. But you could come and say, actually, my situation is different because at the moment my son is ill, or I'm a single mother or a single father, and therefore I need more support. And in those situations, kind of the money would be equal in terms of what you need, in terms of the money that would be given to you in terms of pay would be money that would correspond to your specific needs. Also kind of in terms of kind of this management of, I think it's this kind of, this relationship between, it's a libidinal management and a financial management. We often kind of interviews were told about, funding exceptional projects, exceptional objects, I'm sorry. And I'll tell you an example. So in this Tuesday meeting, someone came and said, I really need a camera because there's a film I really need to do in this banlieue, in this how do you say, in this suburb, and it's really important for me, and I feel that my life could change because of that. Okay, exceptional object. Let's fund that. Let's do that and see what happens. So this is another example, for example, and this was an example that happened at Laborde, and it's very good, a very good anecdote. There was a club of patients. One patient that usually did not participate, was not very active in the discussions, comes and says, "I really need a bicycle. Bicycle is really important for me. A bicycle I need a bicycle to do this, and that." And then the members of the group would say, "But you never participate. Why should we give you this extra money for your bicycle?" And then they just arrived at the conclusion, why not? Let's just give him the bicycle. Maybe something can change. Maybe something unexpected can change. And they did fund the bicycle. And what happened is that this patient formed a bicycle club with other patients. And then they kind of created this, they would go to the village nearby to do, holidays, cycling with the bicycle. So the exceptional object has to do with this. Let's fund something that one might not be fundable, might be unexpected, might work or might not work. It doesn't really matter. Something else that is important to say, and in interviews we're often told about this, is the importance of rotation of tasks in CERFI and the polyfunctionality. So the finance was meant in principle to be a kind of a rotating function, so that everyone would go through, having to deal with funding applications and the management of funds.
And treasury as well, right?
And treasury.
And it became, in that sense, it became a kind of analytical device, because it was through understanding distribution of funding. It allowed them to reflect on their own, constantly objects of conversation to reflect on their own priorities, right? Why do we give money to this and not to that, and etc. So all of this became mechanisms to constantly open their interior out, right? So keep the analytical militancy presence in all of this, in all of this action.
So what we see in these interviews is kind of the importance of really this kind of discussing funds and the total independence between, this kind of libidinal the conditions and the financial conditions, and that's kind of very openly discussed. Where else I can, for example, there's in groups, CERFI was made of several groups. There were several groups all the time kind of emerging. So you could say that there was sometimes a core group, that the core group then subdivided in multiple groups, and there were multiple groups being organized. So there's things like kind of we mentioned in the book, that's something that's called the Psycho Club, and that corresponds to this image we see here. The Psycho Club was a club of psychotherapy by letter. Okay, so this is an example. So they kind of they created the Psycho Club by letter, which was kind of very, very famous at the time. It kind of appeared in magazines and everything. So you could become a member. So there was an exchange of letters. So that's quite interesting. Other examples, there was the Sewing Club, a group that would sew and make clothes for CERFI members.
With Agnes B.
With Agnes B.
At the time.
Initiated by Agnes B. There was a music club as well, which we kind of take some time to speak about in the book, which was quite interesting as well. There was the group Imago, which is a group connected to video. And they use, I mean, there's a really beautiful project in the different clinics, private clinics, working on the basis of social psychotherapy. With this group would go to these clinics and teach the patients how to use a camera, so that the patients, and staff could film the institution and do kind of good projects, but they have those technical means. And they created a club, that's the Imago Club, and those films would be shared with, in between institutions. So it was a video club.
They radically transformed an institution because the patients filmed bad practice in one of them.
Yeah,
I forgot. Right?
Yeah, exactly. What else can we say? Oh, there's the really important work of Revue Recherches. So Revue Recherches has about 46 issues. It's a huge variety of topics, but a very important thing for Recherche was that it's very different from today, because, if I ask, so how long would it take, for example, a book to be written and published and be in the streets, in the shops? It could be very quickly. So because they have a printer, so they would print and then they distribute immediately. So there's a very interesting relationship between, working and the kind of ideas and the projects that you develop in the moment, and suddenly, is published. And Revue Recherches was a very well-known review at the time. There's an important issue of how they would think research as well, as a way of kind of also platforming the margins. So Revue Recherches would be given, the space of the review would be given to other groups that were not part of research to publish. So in this particular case, we have a group on prostitution by prostitutes themselves. So the idea is that why make the usual objects of research to become the subjects? So there's an interesting, discourse about what the magazine is for and what's this process as a mechanism. The other issue we see in the image is the issue on the Histoires Laborde, histories of Laborde, and it has a lot of, patients' narratives and patients kind of, working on the production of research and being involved in all of this as subjects and leaders. Recherche, there's another issue, for example, it's not here. Oh, yeah, drugs, passions, mutuettes. It's about the use of drugs. So a group was constituted about the use of drugs.
Yeah, there was also the other research group, right? Out of all of this ecology. And I think just to raise one point, while there's this kind of major, more serious, as some of them within CERFI would call it, research strand on equipment and power and education, etc. On the other side, you had this ecology of small groups being constituted around sewing, around this and around that, that became a mechanism to prevent CERFI from crystallizing as a machine, from crystallizing as an institution. And a lot of those would end up publishing as well. So the research on drugs is a research group on drugs that said we need money to take drugs, famously. And that ended up publishing on that.
There's a very interesting story about that as well, which kind of the police came and kind of found drugs, but they were able to say we're researchers, so we actually need to use drugs to be able to write about drugs. So that's kind of interesting stuff around that. And then, so that kind of connects with, the idea of exceptional objects and the importance of, being open and not let the group be too closed on itself and not to become too serious or too professionalized. And this leads us to a manifesto that's called The Right to Research that CERFI has written, that's called The Right to Research, which is more or less at the time where there was a move to integrate every kind of research into the state, into the CNRS. And there was, because there was at this stage, CERFI was able, like other independent groups, to receive funding to develop its research, but having the independence and autonomy to self-manage, to decide, to fund small projects within itself. But from that moment, there was this move to integrate research into the state and for the researchers become professionalized researchers. So they've written this manifesto, which were also translated for the book, that speaks about not just the right to develop independent research, but also for non-professional researchers to develop their own research.
Yep.
Yeah.
Maybe we speak a bit about the methods as well through which, because I think we're extending a bit too much.
Sorry, so we'll just maybe speak a little bit about how we've been developing this. I mentioned already that we met all these people that were, former members of CERFI and carrière in the image. So these interviews were really important for us, although we say admittedly that, we're developing this because of our specific, our very specific interests. It's important to show as well how these interviews, how the members think about the work they've done 30 years ago, think about still how that work has kind of they're infiltrated and developed in their lives. What has it led to? And to show, very openly disagreements and conflicts, maybe with our very own research and narratives, but also among themselves, which was very clear and kind of openly debated.
Just on that, I think one of the crucial things about CERFI was precisely because of this kind of analytical ambition from the start and how it remains in the structure, is how all the points of debate and their fierce internal criticism of each other for all sorts of topics were actually incorporated and made visible under the attempt of trying to work those tensions, right? And so even in some of the publications, there are several issues that include their own discussions about how the issue is produced, that include their own critique about who wrote this and who wrote too much and who wrote too little. And all of that is part. And so in some way, I think it's also interesting that in the way that we're doing the book, the ambition is to keep those tensions and revisiting of some of those discussions as part of the process of developing it.
So in the book, we include quite a lot of translations of collective discussions, for example, that we found in archives that have not been published, or things that have been published but not translated. I mean, there's a particular issue in which the issue starts by the sentence, violence has given us this text, because of the amount of, conflict there was in between the members at that point of the writing. So we find that it's important to show that as a very, healthy research process. And then we include also kind of, key texts by CERFI that we found that either collect these collective texts or individual texts as well that speak about programming and intrinsics of thinking about collective programming. And then as a way, almost like a visual way to show there are many CERFIs, we have included lots of indexical materials with lots of archival materials, which hopefully, also kind of invites future research on kind of on these materials. This is Gaetan Lamarche Fadel, which is showing us it's very interesting. Speaking of conflict, so there's there's one issue of recherche and another book that was published by a few original members that were involved in the production of the first issue, and they've kind of reduced the size and eliminated the collective discussions and just left the more theoretical intellectual texts. And she's showing me, do you see the difference? One is very thin, the other one had all the collective discussions.
And this corresponds to that, to a tension that we've noted, that we've traced since the beginning that was taking place in CERFI as it was taking place in the left globally, and particularly in the French left, between what constitutes the avenues of militancy and modes of militancy and the possibility even of militancy. Certain members of the group refused the word militancy, for example, in the way that it was associated. And so I suppose we try to bring in as much as possible a diversity of graphic and visual materials, because if something, it speaks to the richness, the existential richness of what CERFI was as a machine, even though the people that controlled most of the publication were the more classically academic and more writing oriented, the sociologists and etc. And so Recherches, their collectively published magazine, is less semiotically diverse and doesn't capture a lot of that diversity of what was CERFI's work. And so we try to bring that into play. But ultimately, so now to conclude, the title is Schizoanalysis for All. And there's a move that we try to do throughout, which is in some way to bring about the work of CERFI, to bring about in discussions that became core internally to CERFI between what constitutes militancy. In this case, when Gaten Lamarche-Radel is showing both of those, she's both speaking to something very concrete about patriarchy, because these were men that cut it, collective discussions out, but also something perhaps more difficult, let's say, to tackle, which has to do with who is going to read certain types of books and who's going, how do they have a better effect in the world, right? And it is what corresponded very internal critique within debates within CERFI. How far is it, how relevant it is that our collective conversations are always part and parcel of this. And so CERFI breaks apart around that, breaks apart around what constitutes serious and non-serious research, and breaks also around the evolution of left-wing militancy, where certain parts of the group remained connected with networks that were in support of, German, Italian, and international, what came to be known as often terrorist organizations, but they kept in contact with revolutionary militant organizations. Others went much more into an academic context in terms of producing research, right? So this was quite crucial for all of them. And so to conclude, we do this idea of analysis that is bringing analysis first of the pragmatic conditions of political reality, analysis in militant institutions when fighting against bureaucracy within institutions, analysis leading into a kind of what's the proper revolutionary institutions, then slowly becomes analysis across all types of professional institutions. And the moment in which it becomes analysis across all types of professional institutions is the moment that Guattari starts writing about schizoanalysis with Deleuze, right? And the question to which the question to which schizoanalysis as a problem corresponds to, it has been very much debated in the literature based on Deleuze and Guattari's work. And what we feel that that CERFI, out of all the collective work and the internal debates that they've had around actually militant analytical practices everywhere in multiple ways, within research, within themselves, in different views and practices and ambitions of militancy, considering the different possibilities of revolution or not, gives us a completely different depth to understanding what constitutes schizoanalysis, and in a way anchoring it not simply in institutional psychotherapy, and there's some recent literature connecting and redoing the history of institutional psychotherapy, but also in a kind of a constant reflection on revolutionary practices as an institutional, not simply as an anti-institutional, but as an institutional conversation, as a conversation around the constant invention of institutions, on how does one go around preventing institutions from crystallizing, from becoming kind of bureaucratic, centralist, fascist top-down machines. And the crux of it for CERFI ended, and it didn't end in their view, and that's very beautiful for us. Some of the literature that has that has touched upon CERFI looks at it and says, well, and then they ended and therefore this ambition failed. And I think it's very beautiful to interview everyone around CERFI saying, no, institutions don't need to live forever. Institutions are formalizations of certain types of dynamics, of social dynamics, right? Of social engagements, of desires, of collective affective desires and political claims. And François Fourquet would say, CERFI simply dissolved back again into the militant humus. And we try to do at the end of the book is to actually to trace the constellation of, not thousands, but let's say many, many other organizations which formalized all the aspects of CERFI, right? And now it opened up and constituted other organizations. The crux of it being a practice of constantly creating institutions, creating those processes, creating internal mechanisms for the institution not to close upon itself, as Susana was saying, but the institution doesn't need to live forever. And maybe we stop here and open for questions.
Cool. Thank you for that. That's super interesting. I'm going to be super rude then and ask the first thing because I'm going to do that. I find that really fascinating in part because, as we were talking about before we formally started, like, being in a university, you often find yourself in a place that claims to be about creativity and interdisciplinarity and doing all these things, but actually puts you in little boxes and is quite constrictive at times, right? So I find what interesting is that you have a lot of activities here, which I suppose, like the glib version, the way the kids would say is there was a lot of fucking around and finding out. Like the way that you find things is not by sort of like a very, very abstract sort of research, but if you just do things and then they sort of like produce effects and you say, oh, that's super interesting. And I really like the idea about the kinds of collective equipment can function as analytic assemblages. So what I'm wondering is how to put this. When you think about what kinds of collective equipment, what kinds can lead to research, can lead to forms of schizoanalytic behavior, was there any limitations, or was it just sort of like open to whatever people found? What's that Ana de Franco quote? That any tool is a weapon if you hold it the right way. Was the idea sort of leaving it open and just seeing what happens, or was it guided, or?
So there are multiple things in your question, right? So one thing it's important to bear in mind, a slight difference, or actually a very crucial difference between institutional analysis and collective equipment. Or let's say, if you look at institutional psychotherapy as a starting point, okay, let's approach the institution in a kind of therapeutic process, right? To open up a therapeutic relationship. Then Guattari looks at that and collectively, let's say, but I think at this point is actually correct to say Guattari to individualize him a bit, and says, actually, this is core not just to therapeutic institutions, but to all types of institutions, predefined institutions, right? And we need to see this in relation to Sartre, to group infusion versus the serial group and all of that, right? And so, but it's still very much the institution itself, right? Let's work an institution, like the party, the this, the that. Schizoanalysis is fully transversal. It doesn't start, Guattari gets to a point in which I'm not interested in approaching this through institutions. That is becoming co-opted by departments of social innovation. As minor compositions, not so recent ago, but your publication of Moten and Harney's work, and how they give us a good history of the figure of all these HR consultants that come in and help dynamize an institution, sends shivers down our spines, right? We freak out, fuck, I don't need another consultant helping me to create dynamics in my institution and help you realize the problems, right? So there's a neoliberal co-optation of that CERFI themselves and Guattari particularly, who's freaking out already. Schizoanalysis is at the level of transversality, right? So it's not institutional base. It's not about, let's look at one institution. It's simply what types of possibilities of entry in composition, right? So before, and it's addressing capitalism fully on. Now, to answer the other part of it, so I think these different steps speak to an intellectual and political journey, right? And so speak to the fact that when you're looking at the programming of schools, the programming of mental health equipment, etc., and by programming is meant opening up collective processes of understanding the institutional, both in the Marxist sense, the conditions of production, right? But also taking into account desire and libidinal relationships within that, right? That in a way was the limitations that all of them encountered, was that they end up sometimes too blocked by the institution, by the framing of the institution itself, right? So whereas those guys were working in the new towns trying to program mental health equipment, they were also writing and saying in a kind of Foucauldian way, why this mental health equipment and why does it exist in the first place? Should you even be programming it at all? And by programming and by accepting to programming it, are you entering into simply reifying a kind of form of a certain form of power structure, right? They don't resolve it. They decide to do both ways. They decide to both program, because regardless of the mental health equipment, regardless of the fact that it corresponds to a kind of structure of power, right? And what you have is different histories of different types of structures, right? Nonetheless, there's still important things to be done that you can then do by programming it on inside. And there's still very concrete needs of people that need support and care and etc., right? Regardless of the fascist machine within which their lives exist. So they debate this internally very powerfully amongst themselves, while they still do all the different versions. Both, we cannot program this. Let's program it. Let's try to catalyze analytical processes within the enclosure of the equipment. That's not working, but let's still do it anyway, right? So they try all of those. They don't abdicate of anything ever, in a way. So how to choose? There's both an ideological idea of testing. Let's see if we can test. So when they say collective equipment, on the first half is the equipment of the state apparatus, right? The equipment of power of the state. But slowly, and the group also is a bit divided on this, so it's hard to say they, because they have different takes on this. When Guattari, for example, later in Liane Moser and Anne Carrien, Hervé Maurice, so slightly more militant and revolutionary parts of the group, so the other part, François Fourquet, Léon Mourard, Michel Rostin, slightly more less convinced after the May of '68 that any revolutionary possibility was there within the equipment. So the more revolutionary and action research-based part of the group, they will do it everywhere, actually, right? So if we have an equipment from the state, because is essentially the choice is made out of the pragmatics of survival, because the state will give you money. And you can make fund and you can survive and you don't need to find a different type of job. But then they do it with popular ateliers. They do it with FNAC, which is a music shop. They do it on all sorts of possibilities. Any institution, and I think the crux from the English is the different thing. Anything, an institution in French is both to institute, right? It's both the idea of an institution from the state in terms of the apparatus of power, and any institution that 3 or 4 people constitute as a group, right? And so there's a flowing and intellectual continuity between the group and the institution, right? And so they do that at all levels. And so in one way, part of it, there's a predefined ideological attempt of saying, no, let's try to subvert the equipment of power from the state. Then they're saying, part of them saying, no, we can't really do this. This is a lost battle. And then there's an evolution of that argument, and again, closer to the group, closer to Guattari, or more in line with the group closer to Guattari, who starts describing, they write this report from CERFI called Lines of Ligne de Fuite, which was published recently, actually, for the first time, even in French in 2011. And it's published under Félix Guattari, but it's actually far more collective than Félix Guattari in terms of the materials that go into it. And when you speak about collective equipment, there is no longer the equipment of the state. That's just one version of it. Is actually much more anthropological understanding of collective equipment, i.e. every social group produces and needs collective commitment. And so there's an evolution of this transformation. It starts with a certain target and then it changes.
One thing, okay, I really thought, but I see Kevin's finger is being exercised. So I'll hold my thought for a second. And Kevin?
Oh, well, hi guys. Nice to see both of you and fantastic presentation. So yeah, I was just about to ask about lines of flight because this moment of the exceptional object on the fantastic Tuesday meeting, and no surprises that I'd be interested in the Tuesday meeting, coming from a background in therapeutic communities where meetings were all. This exceptional object seems like a line of flight. That suddenly this sense of, well, just let it see what happens. This very kind of very radical notion of what it is to institute something, which I think you pick up very well. For me, as you were speaking, I was wondering about this kind of chicken and egg, you know, the kind of in what way, and I think you've answered it in many ways, Godofredo, in what way was CERFI informing Deleuze and Guattari was absolutely central to the practice. And I was wondering about, do you know much about Deleuze's kind of distance or nearness to these ideas, to these people? Because I don't know much about the history of his relationship to CERFI.
You want to speak to that?
No.
So answering that second part, Deleuze very clearly to Guattari wanted to bring in the entire group as part of the team, and he said, no, I'll write just with you. Very forcefully. And that created a bit of a tension with. So until then, the person that Guattari wrote more often with was with François Fourquet. And so there's a kind of an intellectual love affair there that was quite traumatic in a way. So yeah, that's to the Deleuze bit. Most of the things that we touch, you know, Deleuze was part of, technically, if you look at the research grants, for them, they're very honest about it, right? Which poses a lot of difficulties for more formal academic researchers, which we don't try to be. But for example, if you look at the archives, Deleuze headed some of the research grant requests, right? No, they just put his name in there and Foucault's name in there for the money, right?
Yeah.
So they were very honest about it, right? Bring these characters, put the money in. Deleuze didn't. He participated in a couple of collective conversations, and they are published. So Deleuze, Foucault, and Guattari in 71, when they're starting to do their first report back to the state out of their first research tender, there's a couple of collective discussions in which Deleuze is there, and then he dropped by here and there in different moments. But in terms of more out of moments of political alliance and militancy, but in terms of intellectual will to work with CERFI, not at all. Then Deleuze and the work that we do in terms of CERFI's influence on or not influence. I think the early stages, let's say between CERFI and psychoanalysis and transversality in Guattari's work in that early stage, it's very hard to understand the chicken and egg of who comes first, actually. Intellectually, a lot of the concepts, of course, come first in terms of Guattari, but then a lot of them got mashed through collective discussions and conversations, right? And so while CERFI members would all, you know, even the ones that broke contact with Guattari after a while, right? The breaks were really politically powerful and violent. Even all of them would say, you know, it's a kind of an excitement, both by Guattari and both by Laborde. And Guattari had a kind of conceptual capacity, endless conceptual production capacity to stitch these things together. But the milieu was a very collective milieu, right? And so it's really hard to trace. And we do manage some moments in which is clearly understand, you know, the 9 theses and a lot of the conversations that were happening there, for example. Guattari starts working with Deleuze in 70. And so in 71 already, they're starting to complain that Guattari is not, you know, not contributing as much as he should to the collective work. Guattari was more interested in the assemblies and in the collective analytical processes of the group than the actual conceptual production of the group. And so it starts separating. what the group allows is a test to a lot of Guattari's reflections. And then the group itself, CERFI, but outside of Guattari, has a lot of legitimate intellectual production, right? That they continue by themselves. And again, we're not speaking much to this in this presentation, but the body of work produced by Anne Carrien, by François Fourquet, by all these people are immense, they're very important theoreticians by their own right. So there are moments in which it's possible to trace that influence, and others it's a bit harder, actually, I have to say.
Can I ask quickly a supplementary to that? The notion of this dissolution, the fear of crystallization. It seems to me it's always come from two places in Guattari's work, which is one, it's the permanent revolution idea of Trotsky, and the other is the constant dissolution of the school in the École de Discours of Lacan, Lacan's absolute thing when something got very static or was stagnating, quickly dissolve. And I wonder if those two influences were quite profound on and actually were influential on CERFI as well.
Can I answer that? But very quickly, yes. But I have to say more obviously than that, depending on the age of each CERFI member, was the French Communist Party, and Algeria, right? And so that limitation was really crucial, and a kind of Althusserian idea of the perfect militant around values of truth and etc. So you'll find that a lot of members of CERFI spend a lot of their time complaining about Althusser and complaining about the perfect Althusser, the perfect militant, right? But particularly around ideas of truth, and say, there's no truth in politics, there's desire and libidinal relationships, and truth captures very little of it, right? So this was one of the things, the Recherches 14, which is called the militant ideal, written solely by François Fourquet, was one of the main the person that liked writing more in CERFI. Doesn't mean that he took power. And is very much, most of the time, the Communist Party and Althusser, which were the objects of critique. Then on those of the group that were more into the psychoanalytical aspect of it, then for sure Lacan comes into play, much more for Guattari as well. But Guattari was always, one has to remember, he was always very active, dynamic as a teenager, right? Before he reads Lacan, and before he enters into all of that at Laborde, he was a fast-paced accelerationist in terms of organizing in every organization that it's ever been. He goes to Yugoslavia, he goes to China, he goes everywhere, right? Before CERFI and after CERFI. So it's a very particular character in which anti-centralism and anti-bureaucratic closure were crucial to him. But then, of course, through the entirety of CERFI, not necessarily on the theoretical filiation that you presented, but on the practice of it. Yeah, the entire point of CERFI, not just the group of groups, but also platforming other groups, the exceptional objects, the multi-groups that they had inside CERFI. No one knows who's of CERFI. They had more than 60 people at a certain point, right? They all debate, was this person part of CERFI? God knows. Maybe.
Well, they would say something. If you say so, then that's it. Yeah. They were part of CERFI. Or if they say so, which is really nice. I just wanted to say that in terms of their production, kind of CERFI has a huge contribution of what we say today is research on research, because it's not only kind of the intellectual production about, specific subjects or around specific objects of work, very practical, projects, but on what does it mean to research and what does it mean to produce ideas collectively, and how, issues of collective writing, for example. Sometimes we kind of say that, that this ideal that if there's a collective, they have to write together. I mean, not necessarily, not everyone. François Fourquet, for example, which wrote many reports. If you're not careful, a researcher will easily say, oh, he wrote everything. And then, they just cut all the collective discussions. And why did he write everything? Why were the women not writing things as well? Or why did they not sign collectively? But in fact, he was kind of writing reports because he could write fast, but without reports, they didn't have any money to pay for, less fundable research, or to support researchers who less prone to write really fast, but were more prone to do practical militant work in the field.
Can you speak to that, to the reuse of, because we forgot to say this, to the reuse of funding. So the money that they got to fund a research grant for a specific object of work, they would capture part of that money to fund things that would never be fundable, right? So research on drugs, the money came from some sort of genealogical research out of Foucault, something like that, right? So the more academic chunks of research that got big funding from the state, they would filter part of that money and redistribute it for other research components. That's also the part of the idea of the exceptional object of the line of flight.
Yeah, and that's the importance of also kind of being able to be an independent research center, in this case, a cooperative of research, because they receive funding from the state, but then they would be autonomous. They would have the power to decide how to manage the money, how much to pay, who to fund projects within themselves, and I think that's really key. I just wanted to say something, which is, we talked about, theoretical lineages and where were the influences coming from, were they influencing, were they being influenced. I think something that we found was that there was something that was usually influential, and it's not theory, it's not just practical, it's labor, where everything was meshed, kind of intellectual production of thought was being produced at the same time as you was questioning how much people are getting paid, rotation of activities and all of that. And that, I think, from all the interviews we've done, everyone kind of has assumed that labor was an influential experience for all of them in the know-how, not necessarily why am I doing this because of this and that theory, but you create a group when there's a problem, you rotate activities, you support those weird, exceptional desires, etc., etc., etc. So that's really important, I think.
I just dropped into the chat a link to your article on the grid, Susana, and listening to you talk, maybe I'm just going to float this idea, but if the grid was the practical mechanism at the board through which transversality became possible, through the organization of tasks and rotation, and also the subjectivity animated by that rotating process, right? That's, to me, sounds sort of like transversality at the institutional therapy level, when it's transversality in one place. What you're describing is also this is going beyond that and trying to move it to schizoanalysis is more sort of trying to find that not necessarily one institution but all different institutions. So you'd have almost like a kind of different iterative mapping, not document, but different sort of almost protocol to create that. And is that kind of what CERFI is doing or trying to do?
They're very clear, both when they're doing research on labor, both those that were part of labor and afterwards, not to take the grid as a model. The grid is something that they invented for very pragmatic reasons, and then that worked analytically fine, great, amazing. But it's not a model, i.e. it's not something that can be copied into other institutions that should, it's simply one thing that was there, and maybe it makes sense to copy it in somewhere, but it's not to be thought like that, right? Just to say, the grid was one amongst an ecology of multiple things that it did, right? Freedom of circulation on the grounds, issues of hierarchies, the clubs, the patient-run club with their own budgets. There's an ecology of different types of interventions, some of them successful, some of them not, that needed to be changed. When they started crystallizing into identitarian formations, Guattari would try to break them down, right? So on and so forth. I think when we're thinking in terms of institutional analysis, your point, yes, it makes sense to think institutional analysis as a kind of as something to which labor is always is always there as a reference. If you think young militants looking for other types of institutions, to reinvent institutions, and dropping you with 20-something, 30-something years old in a non-normopathic environment such as labor, that's, revolutionary in itself. It's a massive transformation. It's not simply a self-managed little group that you might hang out with. It's really, really radically different. So it's very influential, very inspiring. But I think when you get to schizoanalysis, for that you need a concept, which is missing here, which is no longer institution or institutional analysis, but which is collective assemblage of enunciation. And when we say assemblage in English, we should actually say assembling. So it's a process, it's not a fixed thing. There's no such thing. An agencement is not an assemblage. In the sense, it's not a static thing. It's a process always, right? So a collective assembling of enunciation. In other words, we're traversed by, if you look at that as an institution, so to say, we're traversed by thousands of them, not all of them run by humans, right? And so there's an evolution in Guattari's thought and practice of these types of conversations when schizoanalysis comes into play, into ecological conversations. And if you see Anti-Oedipus is territorial and ethnographical and ethnological, and Mille Plateau is much more than that. It's cosmological, if you want, right? And so the schizoanalytical is already taking place at the planetary scale, right? Or at the cosmic scale, closer to artistic practices and etc. So, which is his own critique. He got to a point, Lines of Flight is the last place in which he speaks of institutional analysis, but also he spends a fair amount of time explaining what was it trying to be and how it got co-opted into institutional management, right, or institutional innovation. And what at that time, once we go into schizoanalysis everywhere, we're moving away from the institutions that are provided to us into questions of institutional invention. And what types of institutions do we need to constantly invent in terms of thinking climate justice and how it brings together intersectional relationships of power, right? From the concrete molecule to the molecular. And so there's a scalar and ecological shift once you enter into schizoanalytical. But for us, it's important to do the book looking back into coming from institutional analysis and institutional psychotherapy, which is often when we start, and if you look at activist movements today, there's a lot of resonance of schizoanalytical discourse in art practice, very little connection of that with militant organizations. To put it very frank, bluntly, right? This one and that, maybe much more if you go to Argentina and Brazil, let's say you found those compositions, right? Into militant artist assemblages, right? Anarcho-recombinatory, as Bifo would call them. But in general, much less. And so I think if something that we can contribute with this book is to say that the chaosmotic, ecosophic, or ecological of Guattari is predicated and doesn't throw the baby with the bathwater, i.e. it's predicated on militant commitment, right, in a way. And we're trying to keep this connection in there because it was lost. First time I read Guattari was with Deleuze, right, decades ago. And so there's a certain filiation of thinking and of political theory that enters through there, in which the connections, how that ultimately Guattari is writing about that by being, is doing that and interviewing Lula, yeah, is doing that and continuing every day through his militancy, and many of CERFI members as well, maybe less on a planetary scale, more on a local communitarian scale, but very much within militancy, right? And often the schizoanalytical discourse, in terms of the way that it circulates in art and academic production, is disconnected from a thinking of militancy, right? So I think it's important to understand how it is a continuity that shouldn't lose it. Let's put it like that.
Cool. I'm going to have to go back and think about that for a while.
We'll send you some words to read on that.
No, but there's, not wanting to focus too much on the grid, because the grid is fantastic. But there's this, in the same way as they would say, for example, to question, is constructing a hospital the solution? Do we need a new collective equipment? Well, they also invent protocols, little protocols, like Godofredo mentioned, you know, freedom of circulation, the schedule in which something is open, for example, that sometimes kind of make differences, rotations. These kind of mechanisms are really interesting as well.
I think the reason why I brought it up and why maybe isn't even the grid itself, but there's this particular way, I think, particularly for English readers, when we tend to read Félix Guattari in particular, where we end up with concepts that have no histories. They come out of nowhere. They aren't coming out of a certain time of place. All of the sort of backdrop of all the things that happened that led to the formation is kind of like erased out of the concept, right? So you get a notion of transversality, which is almost becomes a sort of like anything can connect to anything. And what I found was fascinating by reading the grid article was going, oh, actually, there's some very concrete, very particular things which led to formulating concepts in a certain way. And when you drop that history, you actually lose a lot of it. Maybe it's not the importance of the grid itself, but more like going, oh, okay, there's these histories and moments which are actually important to understand and how it feeds into the ideas.
I think that's really important. If we manage to do a part of that in our book, that's amazing, because you know, the more and more I think of it, when we kind of read about concepts and conceptual histories, you kind of lots of things are erased, kind of the material history, the political history, the historical context, and that's everything. I mean, if you think about the work of CERFI, the work of Guattari, when they were writing and producing, they were intervening in a field. And they're using concepts and strategically as well. And they kind of, you know, they come from a specific need to intervene in a specific field of thought, or if it's a really practical project, they were presented with a situation in which they had to intervene.
I wanted to say the following, which is, for example, you said transversality and connection, right? And I know you're just putting it in terms of making a point, right? One of the things that happens precisely when that kind of political context against which someone is writing is removed is that our interpretation kind of misses a bit of depth, right? So transversality was about components of passage. Connection is a neoliberal problem, right? So opening connections in institutions is what HR, with their kind of neoliberal converting of the institution, you know, paying you exactly the same, but making you work more in a more efficient way, yeah? i.e. doesn't question the terms of the connection. When they speak about components of passage, it's dangerous in the sense that it puts into question the limits and the structures itself of the institution. What I think it's important in the UK context that might read Deleuze and Guattari, let's say, looking at histories of psychiatry and self-management and self-management and autonomous management groups, is that it comes with a very declared anti-state, right? Not therapeutic communities, or anti-institutional, not therapeutic communities, as Kevin was mentioning, but the anti-psychiatry movement, yeah? And, you know, what is interesting in this guy's remaining in the institutions is that you both criticize the institution, you might get out of it, you might kill it, but don't forget, the moment you do so, you're creating a new institution anyway. And so you need mechanisms to keep bringing the institution into visibility so that you can work it. And so you'll find that throughout, if there's something that was consistent since the early writings in the 60s up to until all of these people die, is a certain disappointment with the kind of generic anti-institutionality or anti-state, in which is kind of a, yeah, just because you're outside of it doesn't mean that you don't create your own mini institution with your mini microfascisms and your mini leaders and your mini heads of state and your mini all of those, right? And they would criticize a lot of that, for example, in Lines of Light, with a kind of self-enjoyment of self-management. Yeah, you're self-managing, yeah, you're managing yourself, but you're actually doing in small a managerial attitude, but in small, by yourself, right? In many of the cases, right? You're a mini state, not a big state. You're the small, but with its little president, right? With its little anarchist president, yeah? And macho leftist and whatever. And so you need these mechanisms constant, and it's not mechanisms as a model, because once things change, you need to throw, but you need to keep constantly throwing different machines to bring you in contact with how you're traversed, right? To break down the individual terms of the relationship is not, we need the department of communication to have meetings with the department of marketing. No, it's, what types of collective desires are cutting across, and what types of little machines do we invent that allow us to start bringing some of these things into play, because they are sure as hell not packaged in the terms by which the institution packaged itself when it was created, right? And so that is, it speaks about what they call institutional invention, right? And so something that for us is crucial in the book, and to which we need your advice very much, is we use the term institution. We will not abdicate from it, even though the term institution leads to all sorts of misinterpretations. Use the term analysis. We will not abdicate from it, even though it comes with it a kind of misinterpretation of being detached and distant from, you know, the analytical. We don't use desire that much, but it's around, and libidinal for sure. And it leads to all sorts of misinterpretations. Yeah, I know. And just to add one before Kevin, and we use militant, which is a term that both François Forquet hated, and wrote a book against it, Recherches 14. Bifo Berardi was a good friend of the group, hated as well. And we decide that we need to use the term militant, right? So a lot of what we do in the end is also unpacking the pragmatics of concepts, and why we that are not historians, we have a political gain in this game, and we have a political ambition in doing the book. Why there's a certain ecology that we need to bring into a contemporary conversation. Sorry, Kevin.
Well, I was, as you were speaking, I was thinking very much of, you know, the kind of the rendering of desire and subjectivity, and also something I've tracked in Guattari's work, which is object A. Because I'm really excited about your exceptional object. I mean, it's just if it's my takeaway today from this delightful work you're doing and important work you're doing, is this concept of the exceptional object, and I just wonder about object A in CERFI, object A personally for Guattari.
As Guattari says, object A, B, C, D, E, F, G.
Yeah, absolutely, and that object A is different, as differently being understood differently from Lacan's usage.
I think you can speak to, remember that interview, that conversation that you're having with Anne-Carrien about the line of flight? What you're saying about the line of flight in your interview.
Which interview?
So conversation.
Sorry, you've done like 5 or 6.
I was reading one interview that you had with Anne-Carrien that I think speaks to this point of the object A, right? So the object A is you know, the partial object and so on and so forth, but it's also the exceptional object in the line of flight. And one thing that Anne-Carrien was raising, which we feel is really crucial, and that point in the conclusion, was that in English, the line of flight feels as if you're going into the blue sky. Remember when she was saying that?
Yeah.
That the partial object becomes a kind of entry point into doing something completely different. And she says, the ligne de fuite, a fugue, is you're spiraling around, but always on institution. You're not running away from the institution. You're not running away from the problem into the blue sky, you're staying with it, right? And so the line of flight, and I think that's how they approach the object A, actually, and the exceptional, they also call it the libidinal objects, right? All the different groups that they would fund, all the weird research that they would do, and etc. Is not to go away into, I want to do a group on drugs and fuck, I'm going to do a new CERFI that just focuses on this and forgets CERFI. It's actually as mechanisms to bring difference, right? It's a kind of, what they call a thermodynamic against entropy, right? Bringing a bit of difference to allow it to constantly reinvent itself. Yeah. So allopoietic more than autopoietic. Becoming other, but in the same, it's a tension between both actually, but a kind of a self-reinvention, right? So the object A is not a line of flight away, it's actually, let's keep on reinventing institutions, keep on producing, keep on, you know, staying with the trouble, perhaps. Stefan?
I can't hear you.
No, still can't hear you. You're muted.
Oh, sorry. On that thought, I'm now going to unfortunately have to bring things to a close. So I'm being hailed by another bureaucratic academic thing that I have to run off to. But I want to say thank you very much for that, and we have to follow up the conversation to keep and to get your book out this year rather than
yeah, exactly.
and another year. But we'll do that soon. Okay.
Okay. Cool. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
And it was nice seeing you, Kevin.
Nice to see you guys as well. Brilliant work.
Thank you for the questions. Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Antonio.
Bye.
Thank you, Lee. Bye-bye.
Okay.